Collectively, Eddie Jobson, John Wetton, Bill Bruford and Alan Holdsworth have played in some of the world's greatest rock bands. Bands like King Crimson, Uriah Heep, Yes, Genesis, Roxy Music and Soft Machine. All their lives they've been rehearsing for this band and this album. Together they are UK. In 1977, at the height of the punk scene in Britain, a new band burst onto the scene. They were an unlikely supergroup with an even unlikelier success and sound. Not rock, prog, pop or jazz, but a hybrid of all of the above. UK released 2 cult classic albums before separating in 1980. During their brief time together, the band, although seeing minor commercial success, would go on to inspire a new generation of musicians and help lay the template for the new wave of progressive artists that were to come throughout the 1980s and beyond. Over 2 videos, you'll hear the story of the rise and fall of one of the most criminally underrated bands of all time. This is the Story of UK Part 1. The seeds of UK can be traced all the way back to 1974. Where after a run of excellent albums, Robert Fripp decided that the band King Crimson were no more, declaring them over forever and ever. This left the rhythm section of the band, Bill Bruford on drums and John Wetton on bass, at a loose end and not really sure what to do next. John Wetton then ended up having stints in bands such as Roxy Music and Uriah Heep, whilst Bill Bruford played mainly as a session drummer with Gong and Genesis. It was whilst on tour in Australia that John Wetton, becoming disillusioned with being a sideman, wrote a letter to Bill Bruford lamenting the loss of King Crimson and proposing that the two form a new band together. Bill enthusiastically agreed and decided to initially form a group with the hottest keyboardist in the world at the time, Rick Wakeman. Wakeman had at this point enjoyed massive success with Yes, but also as a solo artist, and seemed like the perfect fit for the project. Initially called British Legion, the project rehearsed for a few weeks but ran into a few snags, one of which was Wakeman's eccentric and often juvenile behaviour. The biggest issue facing British Legion, however, was A&M Records, who were not at all happy to let Rick, one of their biggest stars, form a group with the ex-King Crimson rhythm section. Determined to carry on, Bruford and Wetton then contacted their old boss, Robert Fripp, who initially agreed to form a new 4-piece band called the League of Gentlemen. Drafted in as the 4th member of this group was a young Eddie Jobson, who had made a name for himself in the band's Curved Air and Roxy Music, as well as overdubbing violin and electric piano parts on King Crimson's 1975 live album, USA. At the time of this new project's formation, Eddie was on tour with Frank Zappa, and was approached at his hotel after a London show by Bruford and Wetton, who told him about the exciting new band with Robert Fripp. Jobson then handed in his notice to Frank Zappa and it was all systems go for the League of Gentlemen. Fripp, however, was still unsure about joining a new group, and ultimately, after finishing up his work on Peter Gabriel's debut album, he invited Eddie Jobson out to lunch in Los Angeles to inform him that he no longer wanted to continue with the League of Gentlemen. Jobson, Wetton and Bruford, however, thought that the idea of a new group was still too great to squander and began searching for someone to fill the rather large shoes of Robert Fripp. It was Bill Bruford who knew the answer, with a relative unknown who had recently contributed guitar parts to Bill Bruford's first solo album. The man in question was Alan Holdsworth, who had made quite the name for himself playing with jazz legends such as Jean-Luc Ponty and Tony Williams. With Holdsworth rounding out the lineup, the new band needed a new name. But what would such an eclectic mix of players dub themselves? Initially, after settling on the name Alaska, Bill Bruford suggested adopting the title UK, as being from the United Kingdom was the only thing that each band member had in common. UK began rehearsing initially as a 3-piece before Alan joined the band, before rehearsing for 2 months as a quartet preparing material for their debut album. most of which had been composed by Jobson and Wetton prior to these rehearsals. Despite connecting very well on a personal level, these sessions were fraught with disagreements regarding musical style, as each member was very well established in their own individual style and sound, bridging the gap between the commercial sensibilities of Wetton and Jobson, along with the jazz leanings of Bruford and Holdsworth, proved to be a difficult task. As lead writer, Eddie Jobson found himself at the centre of this debate, trying to include both elements as much as possible. This meant that the band members were never totally happy with the music and what they were playing. To make matters worse, as each player was in such high demand, there was nothing stopping them from leaving UK for something closer to their own personal tastes. UK then entered Trident Studios in December 1977 to begin cutting their self-titled debut album. Now, to learn about the recording of the album, who better to ask than the album's fabulous engineer and mixer, Stephen W Tayler. With a wealth of credits to his name, including Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel, Rush, Kate Bush, and many others, I reached out to Stephen to ask him all about the creation of the UK album. Stephen was an absolute legend and gave me amazing detailed answers to every single question I asked, and was more than happy to talk about his work on the album. I began by asking Stephen about his personal background and how he got into music, in order to get some perspective on his own personal tastes and interests. Stephen began his music career very young, being a busy multi-instrumentalist and chorister before studying at London's Royal College of Music. Stephen then decided to make the jump into the world of music recording, starting off as T-Boy at Trident Studios and gradually working his way up to chief engineer. I then asked Stephen about how he became involved in the UK album. Stephen writes, "One of the first albums I mixed was Gazoos by Gong, which featured Alan Holdsworth on guitar, although I didn't meet him then. Soon after that, I worked on several projects that involved keyboard player Robin Lumley, including Brand X. Robin had been invited to produce a solo album for Bill Bruford and asked if I would become his recording and mixing engineer for the project. That was a fabulous experience and was my introduction to Bill and Alan. And very soon after that, UK decided to come and self-produce their debut album at Trident, and they asked me to be the engineer. I jumped at the chance. From there we delved into how the album was recorded, as there was much contradictory information online as to how each instrument and part was recorded. Stephen wrote, "Many of the tracks were recorded in sections. That allowed for changes in the arrangement and instrumentation, and to concentrate on capturing the performance for each section. Usually a basic or guide keyboard part allowed the focus to be on the drums and bass. Sometimes a guide guitar part was also played, but frequently that was left for overdubbing afterwards. At times the multi-track tapes were edited together to give continuity, but some sections were recorded and mixed completely separately, and then these were cross-faded and edited to create the continuous pieces for the finished album. I'm sure we did a few test edits during the recording process to make sure it all would eventually work. The drums were recorded using individual microphones for each drum. The microphones for the rototoms were placed underneath. Rototoms were basically a simple frame with a single skin which accounts for that particular tone. Several microphones were used above the cymbals as overheads, and a pair of microphones were set up at a distance to capture the sound of the room. The keyboards were recorded with a lot of interesting techniques, often doubling the organ, synth and piano parts using various microphones and positions. The piano was occasionally double-tracked at a slightly altered tape speed to give that detuned chorus effect. Some effects and parts were recorded with the tape running backwards. Often the Yamaha CS80 synth was played through various loudspeakers rather than just plugging directly into the console. A lot of creative use of equalization and compression as the sounds were committed to tape. The guitar parts were mostly overdubbed, once again allowing for use of various microphone positions. Alan liked to play in the control room using a very long cable to feed into the amplifiers, which were set up with the speakers feeding microphones downstairs in the studio. He liked to stand in front of the studio monitors with them very loud, so he could create and control the feedback. I think this led to a unique tone, rather than controlling the feedback directly in front of the actual guitar amp speakers. A lot of valve microphones were used, especially Neumann U67s, Sony C12s and also Cole's 4038 ribbon mics, which were used on the kit. Mics and setups were constantly changing according to whatever was required to suit the specific recordings. Given the tension present at rehearsals, I was keen to know what the atmosphere was like between the band members during these sessions. Stephen added, "There was a certain amount of friction from time to time, but that can always lead to a great energy and attitude in the recordings. I was often way too involved in the recording process to understand everything that was going on. Especially without a producer, the engineer is the one character in such a situation who never gets a break. Quite often you work with one musician at a time." Mixing the album was also something there seemed to be little to no information about online. So I asked Stephen about the mix, to which he replied, "No automation and no undo button. You had to rehearse the mix moves and get them right while recording to stereo tape. Frequently one had to have the musicians help with controlling the faders, but sometimes they would take control of their own channels and it would become fader fighting. Everything would just get louder and louder as the faders got closer to the top. I think the process of mixing and editing took about 10 days. To conclude, as a massive Holdsworth fanatic, I had to ask Stephen what it was like being in the room as Alan laid down some of his most iconic solos. Stephen added, "Recording Alan's solos was a truly unique experience. It was really exciting and emotional. So often Alan would not feel satisfied and would want to keep doing them over and over again. One had to be careful to know when to say stop because there would only be 2 or 3 versions you might keep, and you would have to record over these and erase previous takes. No endless tracks available, and as I say, no undo button. You make commitments and have to be decisive." Stephen then rounded out the interview by adding, "I was honoured to have been involved with the Bruford album Feels Good to Me, then UK, and very soon after Bruford's One of a Kind. This happened over a period barely more than 2 years. It was such a delight and honour to work so closely with Bill and Alan on such iconic albums." Thank you, Stephen, for all your time and efforts in contributing to this video. The resulting album, both on a technical and musical level, is a wonderful achievement. It was also one of the very first albums which utilised the then brand new Yamaha CS80 synthesizer, which is very much the sound of UK. The album includes the songs 30 Years, a jazzy epic dating back to the British Legion days of which John Wetton was particularly fond of on the lyrical and melodic front, Alaska, which is a perfect vehicle for Eddie Jobson's virtuosity on the CS80, Time to Kill, which is an almost musical theatre-esque jaunt with some wonderful piano, Nevermore, which is Alan's main compositional credit on the album with a fantastic dueling keyboard and guitar solo towards the end, and the closing cut, Mental Medication, which was a brilliant meshing of the jazz sensibilities of Holdsworth with the more commercial Wetton element of the group. The highlight, however, of the album, and arguably UK's entire career, is the album's opener, the 13-minute In the Dead of Night suite. The opener perfectly showcases all of the band's talents and the potential of perhaps the most technically gifted supergroup of all time. Part 1, In the Dead of Night, shows off Bruford and Jobson's mastery of odd time signatures over the song's 7/4 groove, which meshes seamlessly with Wetton's extremely catchy and poppy vocal melodies. Alan also gets his moment to shine as this song contains his most famous and iconic guitar solo. Bruford said of the famous solo, "Alan delivered a knockout blow on the first cut. 94 seconds of liquid passion married to a blinding technical facility that was to go down in the annals of rock guitar history. It remains one of the most perfectly performed, intelligently paced, and brilliantly executed guitar bliss you are ever likely to hear." And you know what? I 100% agree. The second part of the suite, By the Light of Day, introduces us to another key part of the UK sound with Eddie Jobson's electric violin playing, before the suite's closer, Presto Vivis and Reprise. Presto Vivis and Reprise features awkward time signatures such as 7/16, 21/16, 12/16, 15/16, and 6/4, and is the perfect high-intensity tune to end UK's signature piece of music. Released on April 14th, 1978 through EG and Polydor Records, UK garnered mixed reviews from contemporary music critics. It was both lauded and loathed for its virtuosity. Sadly, for the most part, due to the time of its release, UK fell on somewhat deaf ears. Beat Instrumental magazine in 1978 had this to say about the album: "The music won't make you feel instantly cheerful, aggressive, relaxed, or even satisfied. It just isn't that simple, but it is melodic, full of feeling and power, disturbing in its intensity, and worth any number of bland, greasy, takeaway, US jazz rock bore-ins." The album was, however, popular enough to enter the UK charts in May of 1978, remaining there for a total of 3 weeks, but sadly peaking at only number 43. Polydor, though, were determined to make the album a success and released an abridged version of In the Dead of Night as a single, as well as making a music video for the song. The single garnered much attention on commercial radio and did, however, open several doors for the group. Polydor also spent a whopping £20,000 on Eddie Jobson's keyboard rig, meaning they were committed to making this band a success. Throughout April and May 1978, UK embarked on a UK tour, with the setlist consisting of the first 6 cuts from the debut album, along with songs from the upcoming second album, including The Sahara of Snow, Carrying No Cross, The Only Thing She Needs, Forever Until Sunday, and Caesar's Palace Blues. Reaction to the concerts was once again mixed. Phil Sutcliffe reviewed UK's show at Newcastle City Hall on May the 4th, 1978 for Sounds magazine. He noted, "It demanded a lot without offering as much encouragement and sense of sharing as it should have in return. It was a very difficult concert and uneven in an unusual way. Where with any new band you might expect to like one number and not the next, my reaction divided itself into much smaller units, liking 1.5 minutes, then losing touch with the next before picking up the thread again. It seemed that UK were over-conscious of not wishing to bore people, and therefore tended to ring so many changes that the music became overbearing and oppressive too often for comfort. As on their album they were utilising their skills to the full, and that was wonderful to behold in its way, but they were failing to express their character, which they must do if a mass of people are to warm to and appreciate their technical virtuosity. This applies to their music for sure, but equally to the way they present themselves, or rather didn't." Phil does end the review, however, on a more positive note, saying, "When they were all firing together, the band's sound had a dirty, grunty quality, which could be the hallmark of their contribution to the sophisticated end of rock. There is very little doubt that UK could be a fine, innovative band. I hope that as they come to believe in themselves as a unit, they will be able to express more of their depth and gentleness. Forget technique and bare their souls." UK were determined, however, to make themselves and their album a success, and in June 1978, they embarked on an extensive tour of the USA and Canada, which lasted until October 1978. It was on this ill-fated tour that the tension surrounding musical differences during the album's creation resurfaced. This, combined with the difficulty in recreating the studio album's many overdubs live on stage, caused much more friction and tension within the group. John Wetton was particularly unhappy with Alan Holdsworth, going as far as saying that he wanted to fire him near the start of the tour due to Alan's refusal to play any rock-orientated style of guitar. This eventually came to a head when Eddie Jobson asked Alan, the ultimate improviser, if he would be able to play all of his solos exactly the same as they were on the studio album, to which Alan refused. Promoters were baffled by UK on their tour of the US, and as a result UK ended up sharing the bill with a huge variety of bands and artists, such as Van Halen, Al Di Meola, and Kansas. The reception of these US shows was also greatly mixed, but the tour did help raise the profile of the group, helping their debut LP sell 250,000 copies by September 1978. After one of these shows, John Wetton and Bill Bruford were sharing a car back to New York when John, who was becoming ever frustrated with the direction of the group, said to Bill that if Alan were to leave the band, would Bill stay loyal to Wetton and Jobson? or would Bill leave and follow Alan? Bill thought for a minute before responding that he'd follow Alan if he were to exit the group. A few months later, towards the end of the tour, Holdsworth and Bruford were told that their services were no longer required. And after the final show on October 8th, 1978 in West Hartford, Connecticut, the pair returned to Great Britain, leaving now just Eddie Jobson and John Wetton as the band UK. Despite the creative tension as well as the various hardships faced along the way, the band and UK's debut album ended up being massively influential in the decades to come. Musicians such as Alex Lifeson, Eddie Van Halen, Steve Vai, and Yngwie Malmsteen later cited the album as a huge influence on their own works. The album is now also a firm favourite among certain corners of the progressive rock fandom, enjoying a slight resurgence thanks to online forums and interest. But what would eventually become of UK? And who would be able to replace the monster talents of Bill Bruford and Alan Holdsworth? Find out in the Story of UK Part 2, Danger Money and Beyond. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the Story of UK Part 1. If you did, please subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. Tell me your own opinions about the band UK and how you discovered their music, or if you're discovering it for the first time. I'd love to hear about that. Also, if you want to support the channel, there is a link above to the channel's Patreon, whereby for the sheer low price of $5 a month, you get your name in the credits of all future videos, as well as having the smug satisfaction of knowing that you're helping me create these big mammoth videos like this one. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you all again very soon.